To me, when we talk about like stigma in mental health and addiction, that's completely stigmatizing. It's like basically saying, "Hey, you're a dumbass. Like you're using this thing. It's bad for you, and you still keep doing it." That is just framing it as stupid, and it makes it seem as though there's a choice, or the research tries to justify all these reasons why scientifically you're kind of doomed, whether it's your genes or receptors or enzymes. Instead, the way I define it is something much more psychological and emotional in its understanding. And so my definition is that it's a trained pattern where we turn to the outside to regulate our internal state. So we're going for pleasure to get through a bad feeling inside.
My guest today is Dr. Daniel Hochman. He is a board-certified psychiatrist and the creator of Self Recovery, an online addiction recovery program that has helped people in over 40 countries. What I really love about Daniel is that he's a clinician who asks the same questions I do. Not just what is addiction, but why. Why do we keep doing the things we know are destroying us? Why does the traditional medical model miss so much? And what does actually getting free look like? His definition of addiction alone is worth the listen. He defines it as a trained pattern where we turn to the outside to regulate our internal state. That framing cuts through almost everything that's broken about how addiction is typically talked about, and it points directly towards what recovery actually requires. We also get into the powerlessness debate, why he has serious reservations about 12-step programs, the Rat Park experiment, and how Eastern philosophy has shaped his thinking in ways that Western psychiatry hasn't caught up to yet. It's a very rich conversation, and I think you're going to get a lot out of it. Before we dive in, big thanks to all of the new guys who joined Unhooked Academy in the last few weeks. We are off to a rocking start with the latest cohort, and it makes me just so happy to see guys getting the support they need and changing their lives. And also a huge thank you to every one of you listeners out there for supporting the show. If you want to help, please make sure to like, subscribe, or leave a review for the podcast. Just that small thing really does help out a lot. And now, without further ado, let's get into it. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Unhooked. I am your host, Jeremy Lipkowitz. Today, I am very excited to have someone on the podcast who we just have a lot of alignment in the way that we look at addiction and recovery, and really excited to dive into some of his work and to let you guys kind of get an insight into his work. So Daniel Hochman, welcome to the show. How are you?
Very good. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
So for the listeners out there who aren't familiar with your work, can you just give us a little background on who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm a psychiatrist, so that means I go through med school, residency, and so yeah, I have a general practice where I see all kinds of cases, but I found myself doing a lot of addiction work. So I've worked at various kinds of addiction settings, like rehab or outpatient opioid clinics, things like that. And yeah, so I've just gotten deeper and deeper into addiction work throughout my career. I just find it a fascinating topic, but ultimately, what I do is look for underlying issues. That's really the bent that I have in this area.
And, usually when somebody's in this field, they have a personal relationship with addiction in some way. And I actually think that for your case, that's actually not true. You don't necessarily have an addiction story yourself, but what is it that got you into this line of work?
Well, into the work in general, like anyone in it, yeah, less that I had my own personal struggle, with a terrible addiction, more that I've been right next to it at different times in my life with different people, and and then the same could be said for mental health in general. So um, ultimately, what led me to the field is what compels me in this area as well, which is trying to figure out like exactly why do we suffer. So, why does this person get abused and has a terrible addiction, and this person gets abused and doesn't? or this person loses their job and gets terribly depressed, and this one loses their job and they're bad for a week and then they're okay. So I just always like asking why and following those curiosities. And the area of addiction is just sort of the ripest for that, because there's this huge discrepancy between what we know and what we do. So a lot of the times things we're doing does make sense. Like we know we're really stressed about work or we're getting burnt out, and it kind of makes sense that we lose energy and motivation. And then a lot of times things don't. So that's what really intrigues me. It's like, okay, well, I know this is destroying my life or destroying my marriage. Like, why am I doing this? And that just draws me in.
Mm. I love that that draws you in, despite not really having a whole lot of personal experience with it, because it's the plight of what it feels like to struggle with addiction. It's just this deep question of, I know this is horrible for me. I know this is causing so much harm. Why do I keep doing it? Why do I keep going back? And so hopefully we're going to explore that question today and maybe give some insights to the people listening. To help set things off, one of the things I really value about having you on is that you do have a lot of clinical experience. You have that medical background. And so, from your perspective, how do we define what addiction is?
Maybe I'll just back us up a touch and describe where I think the traditional sort of medical approach or lens is missing. So most of my medical circles will describe it as like a fairly genetic issue, something like 40-50% genetic. And, and so people have to understand there's a lot of reasons that people want that to be in the medical field. We want things to have like discrete medical pathways, right? With like, this is a clear gene or cluster of genes, or this is an enzyme, or there's a dopamine deficiency, or this subreceptor is different. And so they try and do things that justifies the research around it, which is usually going to be research on biological mechanisms. And that sounds fancy, it sounds more updated, but it completely misses the more sort of fundamental underpinnings of what compels us to do things that are bad for us. So it's not just like a dopamine problem, and it's definitely not just a genetic problem. And so it's defined by NIDA, which is like the government body. I won't get the definition exactly right, but something like, using more and more of a substance despite its harmful consequences. And it's not like there's anything terribly wrong with that definition. It's just so dry and unhelpful. So it's like, okay, yeah, they're doing something that's harmful despite it being bad for them. That's that's not informative. And it actually, to me, when we talk about like stigma in mental health and addiction, that's completely stigmatizing. It's like basically saying, hey, you're a dumbass. Like you're using this thing, it's bad for you, and you still keep doing it. That is just framing it as stupid, and it makes it seem as though there's a choice, or the research tries to justify all these reasons why scientifically you're kind of doomed, whether it's your genes or receptors or enzymes. Instead, the way I define it is something much more psychological and emotional in its understanding. And so my definition is that it's a trained pattern where we turn to the outside to regulate our internal state. So we're going for pleasure to get through a bad feeling inside. And we can get into, but that bad feeling can range from a little bit bad to very bad, or something as small as boredom to severe history of trauma, but something internally unwell. Um, And so defining it that way for me helps everyone focus on what really counts, which is, how you developed as a person and what you're going through now that makes it such that life is unpleasant. And if you can take care of that, or take care of tolerating the feeling that comes up, then you will be fine.
I love that, because the definition that you're using. I mean, there's so many reasons I love it, but if I can remember all of these, one of them is that just in the definition itself, it already gives you a, kind of an inkling of the pathway out of it. By understanding or looking at addiction from that lens, as opposed to just the description of what it is. It's a repeated behavior despite negative consequences. Looking at it in this learned behavior as a way to deal with unpleasant emotions that you couldn't handle, it already starts to give you a pathway of, okay, if that's what it is, here's how you actually work your way out of it.
Exactly. Yeah. The government definition, when it just says you're using this despite harmful consequences, yeah, it's like, well, what is the answer? It's hard to say there's any kind of answer or pathway or hope there because you're going to keep doing this thing and it's really bad for you. So what if I'm the patient, what do I do? It doesn't provide a pathway. And so that's exactly right. The way I define it, there's multiple pathways, right? So of course, that underlying suffering, there's a million things we can do for that, right? That's the whole field of mental health, behavioral health. So there's a million things to do about that. But there's also points of intervention that come after. So the feeling gets generated. Well, we have ways to tolerate and work with the cravings that come up and the wants, right? The mind's wants. And that gets into a lot of what you focus on and do, right? That's a very Buddhist idea of like we suffer out of our wants. So that's different phrasing for cravings, right? And so there's all kinds of things to do with that philosophically and emotionally. And then the addiction that so when we partake in the craving is when we have the actual addictive behavior because the bad feeling or the wants and craving are not the addiction or behavior yet, right? So when we partake in that, there's all kinds of points of intervention there as well, which are range from grounding techniques to all kinds of like relapse prevention strategies that are more kind of here and now. And then there's also the idea in the definition is we're trying to reach pleasure, right? So I call this all a current, by the way. So there's the pain, you go down the current to craving, you go down the current to carry that out, and that's the addiction behavior. And then the end of the current, though, is a false pleasure, because we don't do any of this unless there's a pleasure at the end. And that's another point of intervention. So you're noticing exactly what I hope to provide for people is if you define it correctly, you now have the end as well. It's like, why am I orienting my life around pleasures? And certainly, immediate ones. Like that's a flawed belief system or kind of life plan, right? And so there's all kinds of things to address in that as well. Like, why do I want those so badly? Why do I feel entitled to that? Or have I even thought through what I'm trying to do with my life? Why can I not delay gratification? There's, do I feel entitled to that? Like, there's all kinds of things to examine all along this current or pathway, and you only need to get some of them right actually to do really well and have control. The more you get, the more it makes the whole journey like meaningful and rewarding. But even if you just get some of them, you at least get control of your behavior.
Yeah. What I really value about this approach, and this mimics my own pathway to recovery. I didn't know it was called recovery when I was in the depths of my addiction. I didn't even know it was really addiction. I just realized that I was hooked on porn and couldn't stop watching and was having all these consequences. And I've ended up finding Buddhist meditation and Buddhist philosophy, and it really opened my eyes, particularly on some of the stuff you're talking about our relationship to pleasure, our relationship to unpleasant experiences, which can range from the highly traumatic experiences to very subtle ones like boredom or loneliness or anxiety. Um, and I love that the approach that you're talking about, it really explores the human side of it. You talked about in your kind of background and training was much more, okay, this is all genetic and 40% of it, is genetic variation. But really looking not just at the biochemistry of it either, but really at the human side of it, the psychodynamics, the psychological element of underpinning this pervasive running away from unpleasant experiences and chasing after pleasant ones.
Exactly. Yeah. And you just when you follow the questions and you don't settle until you get satisfactory or explanatory answers, um, you'll arrive at the at least closer to the truth, right? And so, yeah, genes just don't explain it, right? We have loaded this more in primates because we can manipulate their genes more ethically, at least, than humans. And so, yeah, we've like stacked all of the genes, the so-called, genes identified in addiction. And if that primate then is raised in like a warm, nurturing environment, defined like in that study by like breastfeeding and how much they're kind of held and touched, they have no addiction. And then the opposite's true, right? You have a primate with no markers for addiction, raised in a little bit colder environment, and they do have addiction. So, and I could go through countless epidemiologic kinds of citations around this as well, whether we're looking at displaced populations, people who go overseas, like downrange for war, develop an addiction, and then it resolves when they come back. So we have like countless real life data that shows that the genes just are not really all that implicated. Like at best 10%. And even then, I also want to help people just understand how to work through good questions in the area. It's like, okay, so let's say there's a gene that's 10% of why someone has an addiction, which I don't actually even really believe, and I'll show you why. Okay, that's still just explaining that there's an association, right, with that gene and a little bit higher rate of addiction. But let's pretend, so think about, well, what would that mean? There's no gene that can cause a behavior. So you can have a gene that causes you to have fast muscle twitch fibers or be tall, but not to play basketball. Okay. The idea of genes causing a particular behavior is absurd. The closest we get to that are very primal things, right? That we are driven to do things that ensure our survival as a species. So there are genes that produce, for example, like ghrelin, like a hunger, hormone signal, and so that is a biological thing, and it gives us such a strong feeling that it produces a behavior, right, where we would eat. That's like as close as we get. But these things, genes don't cause us to become a basketball player or to choose, to eat beef instead of chicken or, choose what show we want to watch tonight. Like genes just do not do that. So the idea that a gene is causing someone to use heroin or, like porn, that's just not how it works. It's a very flawed idea.
Mhm.
Um, Now, what does happen, and this is where it gets more interesting, is okay, there are genes that can influence our temperament or our kind of styles. So someone might be much more risk-taking or risk-averse based on some of their genetic profile. Okay, well, a risky person doesn't necessarily use drugs, right? You could be risky and base jump, or you could just be risky and be an entrepreneur or with your stock picks, or just doing anything, right? Physical, emotional, or career-wise that's risky.
Mhm.
So you can even be risky just as far as the things you share with people and conversations. Like there's nothing to say that a risk taker is going to use a substance more than another person.
Yeah.
And I can even flip that on its head and say, like, we also have a ton of people that fall into addiction because they're such a not risk taker. So they tend to
Mm.
be, high on the neurotic spectrum, right? And closed in. And so they can get either more lonely or anxious, right? And not express their feelings. And so that can produce the pathway to addiction as well, right? When we don't express our feelings and it comes out in other ways. Um, so I'm just giving examples of how like this is
Yeah.
not like a linear thing.
Yeah.
And so it's just an example of like how to think through emotional problems. Like the answers need to explain properly. They can't if it doesn't add up, you need to look further.
Yeah. I mean, on this question of, what is how much impact do your genetics play in addiction? my approach to this, and actually come my background is in genetics. I studied genetics, got my bachelor's in it, was working on a PhD in genetics as well, and so it's kind of near and dear to my heart. Um, but the question of what role does it play in genetics or in addiction never crosses my mind, because it's whatever hand you're dealt. The question you should be asking is, what do I do from here? Whether
Mhm.
it's 20% genetic or 40%, the question is, okay, here's where I am. What can I do to make my life better now? And what ownership can I take of my life moving forward? And, however much I can, that's within my power. So that's really, for me, the question of genetics. I never even really look into it. But this topic actually relates to another thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is the topic of powerlessness, which is something that comes up a lot in 12-step approaches. I'm powerless against this. And it's one of the reasons that I personally, never really clicked with the 12-step kind of approach, is this identification with the idea of being powerless towards something. And it's has kind of similarities to this, oh, it's all genetic and this is just who I am. And I'm just curious, what are your thoughts? What did you experience maybe as you were training in addiction and recovery, and what are your thoughts on it now?
Yeah, you're bringing up a really, really major sort of decision point that people have to face when they're going through any issue. But again, I like addiction because it makes everything is even more highlighted, right? So the idea of agency, I know we're totally aligned here, because when we say it's your genes that are causing this, or that it's some other kind of biological mechanism and it's a dopamine issue, um, yeah, we're essentially saying, well, then you're not exactly the agent of the suffering, or thus the pathway out, right? Because the pathway out then is, we need to wait for some genetic manipulation, or we need some medication, to change your dopamine levels. Um, you're taking agency away, instead of doing what everything we know about behavioral health is, we want the person to have more agency. That is just always the right path. We have tons of data on that. Um, so there's a case where we can honestly say that there are reasons to give the person agency. A lot of people in the addiction space are afraid of that, uh, and all parties can be afraid. In 12 step, one of the kind of tropes is that, like, well, your thinking is what got you to this place. So how are you going to trust yourself to get out? And there's these terrible sort of, that's like I would phrase that as it's like a mental manipulation, right? Because it seems true. There's like, it's a seeming truth to reflect back to the person that, well, if you got yourself in this bad situation, clearly you can't get out.
Mhm.
And it's a confusion, right? It confuses the person because it's like, well, okay, well, that does seem true. And then you just kind of get further bought into this system. But yeah, it's a terribly flawed idea. So I could go into it in so many different ways. But like, if that's true, then what's our agency anywhere, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, if we're the conscious sort of being in charge of ourselves, and like no matter what we do, the truth is we're like in a constant interfacing and interaction between ourselves and the outer world, right? So we're neither fully in control or fully out of control,
Yeah.
and so to frame it as this dichotomy that, like, you've lost your rights, guy, you need to now, like, turn your agency over to either 12 step, or this form of treatment or this medication. You're ripping away that person's autonomy, their agency, their sovereignty, their freedoms, their confidence, their security about how they can conduct themselves. Like, you're stripping so many really important things of a person away when you do that. But we're not just saying you have agency to, like, prop them up and make someone feel like more confident and cheerlead them. It's because it's actually the truth, right? Like, we do have the power to change. So, the closer version to the truth here is, you know that, yes, your thinking got you here, but, like, let's guide you. Let's make a safe place for you to, like, work through your demons and what got you here, and now ask me questions, and I can help to answer things or guide you, right? So that you can find your own way through this, which will be
Mhm.
rewarding, meaningful, and stable, right? Because
Mhm.
if you're finding your own way through it, that's now you have the gift that you can carry with you forever.
Yeah.
So it'd be as stupid as like someone's failing math and you tell them, well, your thinking got you here. So like, I'm just going to do your math for you forever. Here's a calculator, or I'm going to check your answers every time. And if you get them wrong, I'll just do it for you.
Yeah.
And that would just be completely backwards.
Yeah. I mean, once you start to understand things like neuroplasticity or things like the power of having a growth mindset and realizing that you can grow and change when you actually put in an effort. I was listening to a podcast that you were on where you just brought up such a, a great example of this kind of the absurdity of this powerlessness statement. And you said, like, if you're sitting in a board meeting with your kind of colleagues all around and somebody puts, some beer on the table or something, you're not necessarily like, there are situations where you clearly do have control. And this idea of being completely powerless just is kind of absurd when you really think about it. Yes, there are situations, environments, contexts where you are less in control. Um, and I think for me, that's the hard part, is that in the 12-step approach, there are so many valuable things. Like, I really value the phrasing, the language of, this has become unmanageable. Like, okay, yeah, your relationship with this thing is not manageable. It's gotten out of control. But then it's also kind of locked in with some of these other things that for me feel like they're holding people back from real freedom, from that agency, from realizing that you are more powerful than that substance. So it's kind of quite a messy system, quite dogmatic. I think that's the other reason I don't like it, is the kind of the dogmatism behind the approach.
Yeah. Yeah, I very much agree. Yeah, and the dichotomies that it presents around, yeah, that powerlessness. And I think you're hitting what does bother me the most about it is that powerlessness part. Um, it tends to not take enough of a nuanced approach, right? It's more like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, you are powerless then. Um, but yeah, as you mentioned with the other example, like we're always on a spectrum of control. I don't believe that we have like full 100% tight control over anything we say or do at any moment, right? And we're influenced by all of the course of human history at any one moment, right? And our biology, of course. So it all comes together at every single moment. And to think we have like complete control over that, no. But, you know, there are things we have very good control of. Like I can decide what word I say next if I'm bringing my full consciousness to it. And then there's a lot of things I have like almost no control over, certainly geopolitics, right? And then there's everything in between. And so the fact is it's a spectrum. It also means it's messy because there's this interweb and a very complex web that like to examine like, well, how are you thinking this thing right now, or why do you feel this way right now? It's
Yeah.
a very complex web, but to call that all predetermined or no agency at all or full agency, no, I know, and I can definitely control my thoughts or feelings. Like
Yeah.
that's all just very silly.
Yeah. And it also, it reminds me of just how powerful our beliefs around things are. There's two studies that were really powerful on this. One was, I believe it was Kelly McGonigal, but looking at stress and our relationship to stress. And they found out that people who believed stress was bad for them suffered ill health when they went into stressful situations. Whereas people who were taught that stress was good for them didn't suffer any adverse consequences from it. And so just the belief around stress impacted whether or not it was good for you, bad for you. Another one, which was related, was the willpower study. For a long time, we kept telling people, willpower is a limited resource, you run out of it. And it was based off maybe some not perfectly run studies, not perfectly designed studies. And then they ended up finding out that your belief about willpower determines whether it's limited or not. And that if you believe willpower is limited, you will kind of run out and get grumpy and make poor choices. But if you believe that it's an unlimited resource, it doesn't fade away. That being said, I still stand by, I believe willpower shouldn't be your only approach to recovery, but that's a different question from whether or not it's limited. Because I see a lot of people using that and saying, oh, well, I've used too much willpower already and I don't have enough. It's the end of the day. So I'm just going to, watch porn and eat junk food. But what I try to remind my clients is, you can always make the choice to step away. No matter how close you are to the brink, to the edge, you can always step back from it.
I completely agree. And I'll just add with what we're saying, sometimes you'll have much fuller control, right? You're in a better position because you're not as desperate or as overwhelmed or as, sleep exhausted, right? Like, but there's other times, when we do. And so obviously then we need to improve our system, right? If we have like 8 things going wrong for us, because that's going to be a very, very uphill battle, right?
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to the opposite.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I love that you're aware of that research around like the beliefs, right? That if you believe that something is harmful for you, like your anxiety, it does cause more physical damage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I got to be a student of Jonathan Shedler, who was sort of the pioneer in that research, where we
Mm.
um, saw that people experience very different physical symptoms based on how they internalize their
Yeah.
emotional self. And yeah, and it opens this window to understanding a lot more about like the nature of suffering, because we can go through a lot of pain in life. Well, and we do, right? We go through so many kinds of pains every day if we're listening or looking for it. Um, and so the pain is like there and all over, but it doesn't need to be experienced as a form of suffering. And so a very good example would be like when you go to the gym, you might get tired or you might get sore the next day. And so there's pain and exhaustion, but it's internalized as very good for me, right? So that's like the growth mindset kind of stuff. And so it feels good, right? As opposed to if you experience the same exact feeling in the muscle, but after you were struck by something, it's like, damn it, and now this is in my way, and it's kind of now impairing my function, and it's an unwanted thing. So it has everything to do with that.
Yeah. And this, I mean, there's so much I want to get into, and we're starting to kind of starting to crack a little bit into the Buddhism topic. But just to go back to that, the belief system, the identity, the stories we tell, the beliefs we have about these, it's one of the things that I see impacts people most practically. And like when I see people who have this belief that they're powerless against a substance, the moment their blocker stops working, their app blocker, they forgot to renew the subscription, it ends, and they have this belief, oh, I wasn't actually stopping myself from watching porn. It was just the blocker doing it for me. And so then they
Mm-hmm.
go right back in the moment it opens up, as opposed to an approach where you are kind of understanding, no, I am cultivating the mental resources and the skills and bringing the supports into my life with sleep and relationships and community and accountability and all the resources that I need to actually make this decision myself and to be stronger than this substance or behavior.
Yeah, yeah. So like whenever we get help from the outside, we just need to internalize and frame it correctly. So go ahead and use a medication, or if you need a mentor. I'm not crazy about sponsors, but like if you need help, go ahead and take it, right? But make sure you're internalizing it as like this is helping me grow in the ways that I need to as a person, not like they're gonna then do it for me. And the way you described it also like makes me kind of, render just a very like normal hero story of like a lot of films or stories where someone develops some superhuman power, right? Some superhuman ability, and then they sort of lose it at some point, later in the movie, right? And then they come to discover that they've transformed themselves, right? That now they don't have this ability to fly anymore, but with my newfound change in my character, I realize I'm capable of all these things now,
Mm.
and that's a very common sort of arc of a story, but also in our lives as well. It's a way we can be our own hero. So like, think of it like the hero's journey, if people are aware of that phrasing. So, the hero's journey is to do that, and we find our meaning through that process, right? And then we gain more power actually in that transformation than what we previously thought would give us that power. And
Hmm.
so in the, framing it like with pornography, it would be like, whereas before maybe like more excitement or more sex or more arousal seemed like the prize, instead we transform to where not doing that is the prize, right? To have mastery over ourselves and to be able to dictate what we do with ourselves. um, that that's the prize. That's the special thing that we can discover and find. And so that's a much greater power, right, than
Hmm.
another stupid video.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so many of, I mean, this is my own journey, but a lot of the guys who I work with as well, it's like the most fulfilling thing is to have, internal freedom from the slavery of addiction. Like addiction
Mhm.
is such a, it pulls us around. And when you really practice recovery, it feels like, you're that self mastery, that agency, the ability to choose how to live your life based on your own will and intention rather than just being yanked around by lusting after pleasant sights and sounds and sensations. On that note, one of the things I really want to talk to you about, you started to talk a little bit about it, but um, it seems like Eastern philosophy has played kind of a big role in your thinking about addiction and recovery. Where did that start and where did that come from?
I don't know if I could say exactly where it started. I don't remember like a moment, but I do remember um, the idea is really appealing to me from like as a young teenager even. um, where I just didn't find that conventional thought in the West really provided those answers. So the same way I was describing earlier, where whether it's addiction work or mental health, where I don't rest until I find answers that really add up and triangulate in a sense, right? Where it doesn't only make sense for this one thing. Because like a lot of people, I'll give an example, like with say like a lot of like monotheistic religion, like a lot of it is, well, if I suffer or something tragic happens, that it's for a reason. and and that it's not like, man, there's so many things to say about this, but that's just an example of where that can really fail people sometimes, right? That answer is often not enough for people living today in this world. And so examples like that show like there are other traditions that have answers that seem to make more sense across more kinds of suffering or domains and across time. And so I've just always found that the Buddhism and other Eastern philosophies have just always felt so universally true
Hmm.
and sort of back testing, if you call it that. They really have a so much validity across domains. And so for me, it's more just being a student of trying to discover like more about how we suffer and the ways through. And it matches interestingly with the literature as well.
Hmm.
It's just that they aren't using that language, say in the West, with like a normal research paper when someone's trying out some like latest, greatest therapy technique. And it's like, hey, you dummy, like you're doing about like 2% of this larger offering that Eastern tradition provides. It's already been there. So like,
For thousands of
why
years.
not
Yeah.
why don't you turn around and be a student of that rather than pretending you've got like this new strategy?
Yeah. I think this was the case for me, but I think particularly for people who value the scientific approach, value having things that add up logically, and where you can kind of see and triangulate and say, okay, if this is true and this is true, and we understand this about the mind, and this is how the mind functions here, and oh, therefore it makes sense that when I do this and do that, then this happens. And so, for me, Buddhism was less about religion or kind of the origins of the cosmos, and it was really just a way of understanding the nature of the mind and the dynamics of the mind, and understanding how the mind functions and how suffering arises and doesn't arise, and where happiness and fulfillment come from. And I remember, just as you're saying, like these things that we're just kind of really studying now with science, have been there for thousands of years. I remember this one phrase that really turned me on was a quote from a neuroscientist, Donald Hebb. It said, "Neurons that fire together wire together." And it really
Mhm.
helped me understand. I was studying genetics at the time, understand what neuroplasticity was. And okay, if you frequently use these neural pathways, you grow the synaptic connections there, and you're more likely to have that kind of thought process happen in the future. And it turned out the Buddha 2,500 years ago said, what you frequently think and ponder upon becomes the inclination of the mind. And that's essentially the exact same sentence. It's like the more you use these neural pathways, that becomes the inclination of the mind, and it's more likely to happen in the future. And so I think, when you understand addiction from this lens of just looking at the dynamics of the mind, it becomes a much more tractable way to approach recovery.
Yeah, for sure. And I think in the addiction space in particular, it has the best answers because according to my own understanding of addiction, that real turning point of why, like, whatever I'm suffering with, whether that's boredom or terrible trauma getting re-triggered, and everything in between, the time at which it becomes like, yes, I'm going to watch that video or I'm going to have a drink is is when we partake in the want. And so
Mm-hmm.
to have a philosophy that provides answers for like how did that want arise and can I tolerate that want? Right. So it's like you're saying, we already have this wisdom that existed thousands of years before we are now doing research on this stuff. And so researchers now call it these different things, and we've got the neurochemical understanding, but it hasn't changed what some very smart humans have pieced together long ago.
Yeah,
And
and the mental tools that they developed. I mean, that's what's really, I am just kind of in love with Buddhist meditations, because it's like these people who were just really smart scientists of their own mind. They just developed tools that anyone could do to start to work with what was going on in their own internal experience. I mean, that's what meditation is. It's like these different ways of working with the mind and getting off that train, like you said, that inflection point between there's a pleasant emotion. After the pleasant emotion becomes a liking becomes a wanting becomes a craving. And if you catch it in that inflection point, then you can actually stop the addiction. If you say,
mm,
"Oh, okay, this is a pleasant experience. There's liking in this experience, but I don't have to act out on it."
yeah, yeah. And now like let's contrast that with what all of I don't just hate on, America. It's like it's just where people are heading. It's not one country or company, but we're obviously inundated with just consumerism, right? We want everything bigger, better, faster, stronger now, right? And um, so we are told, like that we should be able to achieve our wants, and even like very good parents are trying to teach that to their kids. It's like, oh, whatever you want, whatever you dream, like, work for it and you go get that. And there's not much discerning on that path between like really enriching, rewarding things to pursue versus more material or consumerist sorts of drives. And so, because people don't get too much of a nuanced teaching around that, or nuanced sort of um, feedback, people are generally just inclined to want more faster. And so it's the opposite of what we're talking about, right? It's a life philosophy, and we begin to feel then entitled to our wants. So, if you want this meal tonight, you can have it. Press this button here, and it's at your door. And I could go on and on about the millions of ways that life is made up that way now. And so sometimes I think people look at the idea of, they kind of think of some Buddhist at the top of a mountain who doesn't listen to music or get to eat really good food, or, do like really fun things. And so they think of it as like a less fun life, and tend to not really challenge that idea too much further and conveniently pursue their own um, more material sort of desires. And but instead, I think what is a nice way of engaging with what we're talking about is to understand that um, you can view restraint as just restraint and boring and restrictive, but restraint is also immense power and freedom.
Mm,
So like, we're talking before about a couple examples that um, one could be like, if you're really strong, right? The idea wouldn't just be to like use your strength for fun and pleasure, right? The real reward is to be strong and not use your strength,
mm,
whether that's physical or with status or anything, right? So you want to be really strong and then be able to, if there's a couple people in a conflict, be able to step up there and mediate, right? And because you're so strong that you command their attention. And
mm,
same could be in a boardroom and your status, right? You want to be really powerful, but you don't want to exert it as far as like then, really demolishing people. The restraint is what's so rewarding when we say, I've built up this strength, and the restraint is what makes me feel better, more powerful, more reward, and I have more freedoms, right? Because I can
mhm.
step into different situations with confidence. And so the same thing then is true, right, with say a porn addiction. Like, it's not like, oh no, I don't get to do this fun thing anymore. The restraint is not like, blocking fun. It's the pathway to strength, wisdom, reward, right? With much deeper rewards, of course, and the self-empowerment that comes with that.
Yeah.
And so that's real freedom.
Yeah.
That's a lot more fun.
Yeah. Well, what's coming to mind by from what you're talking about is, you're talking about society, and we live in this, where everybody's just, okay, more pleasure. You push the button, you get this TV show and that, bag of potato chips coming in, and people have this view of a life of restraint or whatever, that there's no fun in that. And one of the turning points for me was just realizing that there's so much more to deep inner fulfillment and real happiness, happiness with a capital H, not the ecstatic kind of like I'm at a rave with some drugs, but there's so much more to real inner fulfillment and flourishing and joy and all that than just having pleasant experiences, than having quote unquote fun. And I think the sad part for me is that there's so much of our society, as you say, is just based around proselytizing a life of sense pleasure that
Right.
is devoid of real human happiness and connection and meaning and purpose and growth and self mastery and all the things that really make us feel full inside.
Yeah. And it's something that I think anybody knows what we just said is true. I don't know that people necessarily question that so much unless they're just being, tongue in cheek or having fun with the idea. I mean, everybody knows that to be true. And in my work, I find that a lot of people are very ready and hungry for the correct prompting to take them through that path. But I think a lot of people don't necessarily access the path through
Yeah.
that,
Well,
or
let
they
me
kind of
pause you for a
skip.
second, because I want to dig into this, because you said you think most people kind of know that to be true. And in one sense, I agree with you that I think if you really were to sit down with somebody who is in a reflective state and say, what's really important to you? What really matters most? They would be able to give you these answers like family or, connection, being of service, all those things. And yet, most of our behavior, even myself included, like I'm not just pointing at everyone else, we still tend to kind of live out our lives wanting more external validation, wanting things to be more comfortable, wanting, just more comfort and pleasure. And so it comes back to this question. I almost wanted to ask you this at the beginning, because this is something that was kind of seminal to your own story, was this question of why do we do things that aren't good for us?
Yeah. Well, so okay, yeah, we talked about, clearly the right choice is to do these more meaningful things with ourselves, right? And find like real love instead of, an OnlyFans channel, right? That's clear. And that's what I'm laying out. Like that that's obvious to people. Um, where it goes wrong, in short, is, it feels as though the quicker shortcuts are more intensely sensed as like rewarding or escaping from that underlying pain or distress.
Mhm.
So, so almost all the things we do that are not good for us are more temporary solutions. And um, and so it's a very, I'd call normal, not like unhealthy. It's a very normal human experience to try to train ourselves to do things that we are more certain provide solutions. We don't necessarily want to wait and see if maybe this other pathway that takes a while to work on is going to take me there. Um, and so that applies to addictions. It applies to investing. People want to make a quick buck too, right?
Mhm.
We we want something that like that feedback loop is hard to train when it's multi-year, and it's a feedback loop that trains way too quickly and strongly when it's like a 1 minute feedback loop.
Mhm.
Whether that is, an orgasm or food or money or likability, right? And posting things and getting like status kind of feedback. So I think it's like a fairly normal mechanism that's in all of us, where we're very subject to get trained poorly. So some of that is just science in action.
Mhm.
Um, but going another level there, like there are still people who have more underlying suffering are going to have a tougher deal with this, right? Because it's a more constant managing of the bad feeling.
Mhm.
And for a lot of people, it's just some kind of discontentment with where they are in life. It's not necessarily a trauma or anything. It's just that they're not very happy about how life is turning out. Is like a very plain way to put it.
Mhm.
And so if you
Are you
feel
familiar with
mild,
the rat park experiment?
oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Do you want to? Because I always explain. I've said it many times on my podcast, but I've always the one explaining it, and so I'd love to hear someone else. What's your kind of takeaway from the rat park? If you could explain it for the listeners.
yeah. Well, I can't help myself from also providing the context around the research community. Academia has billions of dollars, right? Always going into these studies. You get more rewarded when you do research, when you say like, I'm going to do this particular enzyme and this particular thing, and then you isolate, right? This poor rat is in this small cage and it's given access to only like two choices. There's no friends in there to play with, there's no toys, there's no room. And so of course you can make this poor thing addicted to anything you want, right? And so the researchers setting up those studies are rewarded, right, for finding a result, because then they get more research dollars the next year and more postdocs working under them the next year after that. And so then those postdocs go on to do other research on the other subreceptors. And so we've made all these poor rats show these like what they're portraying as like clear studies showing these pathways for addiction. And instead, what we found, and this is what I applaud science for, is replicability. So you set up a study and you say, we used this dose of cocaine and it was over this period of time and so on, and this, in this exact species of rat. So when we go back and try and replicate those studies, but give these rats a more normal life, right? So it's a larger park for them to play in, socialize, and rough and tumble, and get their nerves out, and have a normal sleep cycle, and have other access to like other choices of food and water. Basically, it upended all of the addiction research. these rats, when they're happy, just don't need it. So a happy rat just doesn't turn to addiction because it doesn't solve anything for them. The addiction is only solving something for the rat when you've boxed him in and he's cold, scared, and lonely and doesn't know what to do with himself. So it's like a person too, and I love that you bring it up in that moment, right? If you're not happy with your life, or you're just empty and you just don't know what you're doing, addiction provides a very good solution. And I like to be honest about that because a lot of people almost gaslight the whole situation and say, well, so just do the right thing, or make these like more meaningful choices. But people have to have a taste of what that means, or what that is. You have to admit and confess to people, and I do this with my patients. Like they're a little bit surprised sometimes when I'm trying to prompt them more to describe to me why they do like doing the destructive thing. Like,
Mm.
a lot of people are afraid to go there, or they think that it's a useless exercise. But you have to first describe very clearly what your current solution is. And you have to hand them that, right? That, yeah, if you're bored or you don't feel good about your partner or something, and you don't know what else to do with yourself in the evening, pornography is actually a good solution,
Mm-hmm.
for the way they frame it and for their current circumstance. There doesn't need to be anything confusing or morally wrong there. That's how I approach it, is that that is a real solution.
Mm-hmm.
And and you have to start there before you can more honestly try and um, present other pathways through that suffering and make a compelling case for why doing hard work will be worth it. Because if
Mm-hmm.
it's not, then of course do the shortcut. So I kind of put the onus on the patient to tell me why it's so important for them to find another path. The more I'm just sort of, dragging someone through the path towards enlightenment, that's not what a good teacher does.
Mm-hmm.
That's not how to do it. So yeah, it starts with defining the problem, is
Mm-hmm.
where the path begins.
Yeah. Yeah. What's lacking, and what is the behavior giving to you? What is it
Hmm.
providing that you're needing? Whether it's
Yeah,
excitement, and that's why you're reaching out in times of boredom. Maybe it's giving you a sense of connection because you're feeling lonely or isolated. To really understand, what is it giving to you? Why do you keep going back to it? In a
yeah,
non-shaming way, but in a really understanding way.
yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. Where, if somebody's listening to this, and they have been struggling, let's say they know a lot of this stuff, because they're listening to podcasts like this, they understand what addiction is, and why it's got them hooked. What is one of the first steps you would recommend for someone who has maybe been in the fight for a year or a couple of years and still feels kind of stuck?
Yeah. Well, so the stuff we're talking about, yeah, would be sort of the long game to play, where you you start to believe in the idea of, and then start to see what happens if I test out this idea that there's a life of more meaning and freedom and mastery. But yeah, like right now, you're in the throes of something, and you just need to do something. And one of the early ways, I think, to um, like anytime we embark on this journey, we need to have enough early excitement that we can see that that pathway is real, that it's not just bogus or just us talking woo woo here, and
Mm,
or whether we really believe it or whether we're just blowing smoke. Like people ultimately aren't certain enough usually to commit to
mm,
a path meaning. And so one of the very tangible things that people can do in the here and now to understand that, oh wait, this really could happen for me, is practicing just a little bit more restraint. And
mm,
so that could be directly in the area of concern. So restraint might be, if it's pornography, like trying to be really technical about what you do. And so maybe you just don't even open up your computer at all that evening, or if you're doing that, say twice a day, get that to an average of 1.5 for the week. But even narrowing it down further, okay, and 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 I'll give an example because it's easier to do this, say with other things than pornography. But um, let's say, and that's why I say it doesn't need to be that you only practice it with the area of concern. It could be, say, with food. And so even if you don't struggle with food, can you open up a bag of chips and have none? Or can you have like 2/3 of the bag and leave the rest, right?
Mm.
And either throw it out or share it with someone or whatever you want to do. But come up with a small challenge for yourself so that you can demonstrate for yourself that I can practice restraint. You may go up to the fridge and instead of getting a soda, get water, or you may go up to the fridge to get a soda, but not like choose to restrain and not
Mm.
get the soda. Whatever challenge you want to come up with yourself, where essentially you're restraining from just one really minor micro decision and just standing there and tolerating the experience. Usually that experience is only a few minutes. So somewhere between like 5 and 10 minutes is what it is for most people. Even if that's a couple hours, though, it's not going to be more and more, right? It's going to be a shorter kind of experience. And if you can tolerate that once and see that you can come out the other side, even if you then go do it afterwards, I would still say that's a successful practice of some restraint. And there now it's not just fluff or a self-help book or you and I saying, oh no, you can do it, and self-restraint and power. You're actually now coming into contact with
Mm.
that power. And
Mm.
when you can come into contact with that yourself, that's how you can actually feel the validity of this pathway.
Yeah, I love that because it also ties into what we're talking about with powerlessness. And like I think your approach and my approach, it really is almost the kind of the opposite, which is really taking back your power and realizing, like as you say, getting in contact with that power you have within yourself, to have restraint, to have discernment, and kind of a skillful approach of saying, this is not healthy for me, and I am going to choose to have some restraint here. I'm going to choose to live differently. And getting in touch with that power is the opposite of kind of learned helplessness or learned powerlessness. I think that's a powerful start.
Precisely. And just doing that and knowing that if I did that once, or if that's point oh something percent of my pathway, like towards the final sort of feeling of tolerance and comfort, like I'm at least my step is on that path now.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're proving to yourself with small wins, just stacking up those wins of saying, oh, I can actually change my behavior. I can choose differently from what I thought in the past.
Mhm.
And in that experience, you're regaining trust in yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, I know you have a full program that walks through a lot of this with people, helps them kind of walk the path of recovery. So could you tell the listeners just a little bit about kind of what your program is and where to find it, and how they can get in touch with your work?
Yeah, it's called Self Recovery, and it's selfrecovery.org. And basically, all these kinds of things we're talking about, it really just guides people through it all, so that the main idea would be, most people don't really access a very complete guided approach through this. So they do a piece here and a piece there. Maybe they're even doing trauma work, but there are all kinds of themes and philosophies that really make the whole pathway easier. So a lot of people just get stuck somewhere where it's a lot harder than it needs to be for them because they're working with only like one or three different kinds of approaches. So it's a guided approach that seamlessly weaves together actually dozens and dozens of really powerful strategies, ranging from, yeah, some more superficial ones like we just said, to really deeply philosophical ones that really prompt like thinking through how to conduct yourself. your relationship to your feelings and who you are. So yeah, it's it's made up of videos, exercises, and different reflections. There's music in there. There's a whole mindfulness series specifically built for addiction, and some other things in there too. Um, so yeah, it's meant to be an accessible thing, for anyone. And it's all on demand. It's essentially just a course,
Hmm.
and so anyone can do it, on their own time and work through that.
It sounds like a wonderful course. I mean, I love it. Really is so important to have both the kind of superficial, just, little nuts and bolts hacks alongside the deep work. Because some people just focus on the hacks and they say, okay, I'm just going to download this blocker. I'm just going to put my phone outside the bedroom. And they don't do any of the kind of the inner work. And some people just only do trauma work, but don't actually get to the nitty gritty of, yeah, I need to leave my phone outside my bedroom and not have it on the pillow next to me at night, And so combining those really does sound like a beneficial approach.
It just makes it easier, and ultimately, it's not just to be successful with some kind of addiction. It's just to um, it, understand that there's other ways to conduct ourselves and live that are just
Mhm.
so much more comfortable and meaningful.
I mean, yeah, that's a great kind of place to end it there with it. All of this work, it's not about addiction and recovery. It's how to just live more skillfully and make better choices that lead to your own happiness, whether you're
Yeah,
struggling with compulsive behaviors or not. Yeah.
exactly.
Amazing, man. Well, that was a phenomenal conversation. I really enjoyed having you on and having your expertise. Um, yeah, really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for having me, Jeremy. I enjoyed it too.
Yeah. All right, folks, that's it for today. We'll catch you guys on the next episode of Unhooked.